It didn't happen with fireworks, no press conference, no public outburst, no official announcement from the palace or the Australian government. Just silence. Meghan Markle, once hailed as a modern-day royal icon during her 2018 visit to Australia, is now quietly, methodically, and completely frozen out. No invitations, no events, no camera-ready charity walkabouts, nothing. And in the world of royalty and celebrity, silence like that isn't just awkward, it's devastating. Back in 2018, Meghan was everywhere. Headlines gushed over her every step. Crowds lined the streets. The media painted her as the duchess who could do no wrong. But behind those glossy photos and carefully staged appearances was a different story. A story of missed signals, misunderstood roles, and a growing unease behind the scenes. Now, years later, that unease has curdled into something far more damaging: indifference. And here's what makes it worse. No one is publicly saying a word. That's the strategy. Meghan Markle has been erased from Australia and much of the Commonwealth. Not with anger, but with indifference. A diplomatic snub so subtle, so cold, it doesn't need to be explained. Because in the world Meghan tried to conquer, relevance is everything. And when they stop talking about you, the damage is already done. But how did she go from royal darling to silent pariah? And why does this quiet erasure sting more than any tabloid scandal ever could? Let's start with the tour that changed everything. On paper, it was a fairy tale. Meghan Markle, the newly minted Duchess of Sussex, arrived in Australia with Prince Harry to a media frenzy and screaming crowds. Paparazzi cameras clicked like machine guns. Every wave, every outfit, every smile was front-page news. The Australian press called it a triumph. The monarchy declared it a success. And Meghan? She said the tour changed everything. But that statement wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. Because behind the polished photographs and flattering headlines, something far more complex was unfolding. What the world saw as adoration was, in reality, a fleeting infatuation. Meghan may have dazzled the cameras, but insiders on the tour saw something else: tension, miscommunication, and a growing discomfort with royal protocol. What should have been a victory lap quickly exposed the cracks in Meghan's understanding of royal life. Touring as a royal isn't like walking a red carpet. It's not about popularity, it's about duty. And Australia, a country deeply familiar with the monarchy's rules and rituals, picked up on the difference fast. Meghan's Hollywood instincts, her desire to connect directly, to rewrite the script, to improvise the role of modern duchess, clashed with the rigid expectations of a centuries-old institution. And while the crowds smiled, the palace took notes. It was during this tour that whispers of trouble began to circulate. Meghan reportedly began asking why she wasn't being paid for public walkabouts. Staff described friction. Royal aides found themselves mediating culture clashes between the Sussexes and the traditional framework of royal operations. What should have solidified Meghan's position as a Commonwealth favorite quietly marked her as a potential liability. The 2018 Australian tour didn't launch Meghan into global royal stardom. It marked the beginning of the end. And the fallout? That was just getting started. The walkabouts were supposed to be a highlight. Dozens of adoring fans lining the streets, waving flags, holding flowers, hoping for a brief moment with the Duchess of Sussex. Meghan smiled, posed, accepted gifts, and even gave a few emotional sound bites. It looked effortless. It looked glamorous. But what the cameras didn't catch was the moment she reportedly asked a question that sent shockwaves through the palace. Why wasn't I paid for this? To anyone outside the royal bubble, that might seem like a fair question. She's a public figure. She drew crowds. She gave her time. But inside the monarchy, the very idea was unthinkable. Royals don't get paid for walkabouts. It's part of the job, a centuries-old duty that relies on public service, not performance fees. But Meghan wasn't raised in that world. She came from Hollywood, where public appearances mean brand deals, compensation, and control. And now, suddenly, she was expected to perform, non-stop in front of thousands, without payment, without applause, and without personal recognition. Just duty. And to Meghan, that was the first sign something wasn't right. Insiders say the comment raised eyebrows. Palace staff were stunned, not just by the question, but by what it revealed. Meghan didn't see herself as a cog in a machine. She saw herself as the draw, the brand, the headliner. And in Australia, a country that respects tradition and expects humility from its royals, that mindset hit a nerve. What followed was a shift, not in public perception, at least not immediately, but in how the institution viewed Meghan behind closed doors. She wasn't just unfamiliar with protocol, she was challenging it. And that challenge, subtle as it seemed at the time, was the start of her isolation. The tour that began with cheers now carried a hidden fracture. The Duchess wasn't just walking through crowds, she was walking into conflict. And the palace? It was already preparing for the next move, one that would be delivered not with words, but with silence. There was no memo, no headlines, no official declaration. But somewhere between the cheers of 2018 and the awkward silence of the years that followed, a decision had been made, and it was absolute. Meghan Markle would not be coming back to Australia. Not officially, not diplomatically, not as a representative of the crown. And the brilliance of it? No one had to say a word. The silent blockade began the moment the royal tour ended. Invitations that once seemed inevitable quietly disappeared. Events she might have attended were never planned. Offers for joint appearances dried up. The Duchess, who once captivated Australian media, was now treated as a PR liability. Deliberately left out, carefully avoided, and politically erased. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a strategy. Because unlike a scandal, which burns hot and fizzles quickly, silence lingers. It doesn't spark a defense. It doesn't allow for a comeback. It creates a vacuum, a public absence so deliberate it can't be ignored. Meghan wasn't exiled, she was simply omitted. And that omission spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, Commonwealth leaders followed the palace's lead. Australia, like many others, knew better than to risk diplomatic confusion. Meghan and Harry weren't working royals anymore. They weren't sanctioned. Their presence, once seen as charming, now came with baggage. Netflix contracts, podcast drama, legal battles, and relentless media attention. The crown couldn't afford the chaos. The Commonwealth couldn't afford the headlines. So they did the one thing more devastating than rejection. They stopped acknowledging her altogether. And as her name vanished from guest lists and her image faded from the royal narrative, one thing became painfully clear. The silent blockade wasn't temporary. It was permanent. And it had only just begun. Meghan's freeze-out wasn't just personal. It was political. And it wasn't just Australia making the call. It was part of a broader, calculated strategy stretching from Buckingham Palace to every corner of the Commonwealth. Because after that 2018 tour, and especially after the couple's post-royal freedom flight to Montecito, something spooked the system: the fear of rogue royals. According to Tom Bower's relentless reporting, the palace saw a growing risk, a duo operating without oversight, wielding royal titles, but no royal responsibility. Meghan and Harry had begun carving their own path, styling themselves as global figures, humanitarian voices, celebrity activists. And in doing so, they triggered the very thing the monarchy feared most: a constitutional crisis without the paperwork. The Nigeria trip was the final straw. That so-called quasi-royal tour, complete with speeches, photo ops, and carefully curated outfits, looked and sounded just like an official engagement, except it wasn't. No royal clearance, no diplomatic coordination, no palace supervision. Just Harry and Meghan, smiling, waving, and leaving confusion in their wake. To an outsider, it looked like a charitable appearance. To insiders, it was a diplomatic nightmare. Countries scrambled. Were they expected to treat the Sussexes like working royals? Did they still represent the monarchy? Could their presence be used for political advantage or cultural leverage? No one had a clear answer, and that ambiguity was dangerous. The crown depends on clarity, on hierarchy, on rules, and that's when the palace acted. They didn't issue a public decree. They didn't strip titles. Instead, they picked up the phone. Quiet calls were made. Commonwealth governments were briefed, and the message was unmistakably clear. Do not host them unless it is cleared by the palace. Australia listened, loud and clear. No angry editorials, no drama, just a slow, strategic blackout. Where there were once tour schedules, now there was silence. Where there were once formal invitations, now there was nothing. The strategy wasn't to punish, it was to contain. Because allowing Meghan and Harry to tour independently would open a dangerous precedent. Ex-royals playing royalty without permission, mingling with heads of state, blurring the lines between personal brand and national duty. It wasn't about popularity, it was about preserving the system. And in that system, Meghan and Harry had become a threat. So the doors closed. Politely, permanently. And in the most cutting twist of all, Meghan didn't even get a chance to fight it, because the blockade was already in place before she realized she'd been locked out. The silence from Australia wasn't just diplomatic, it was deeply symbolic. Meghan Markle wasn't just being ignored because of protocol or politics, she was being sidelined because, without royal backing, she simply didn't matter anymore. And perhaps the most brutal part of Tom Bower's investigation, Meghan and Harry weren't just rejected, they were financially irrelevant. Let's break this down. Once upon a time, the Sussexes were riding high. Royal titles, global attention, and access to a monarchy-backed budget that covered everything from security to luxury hotels. Every appearance, every private jet, every carefully coordinated outfit was funded or justified under the royal umbrella. But once they stepped away from the firm, those royal privileges vanished. And with them, so did the funding. According to Bower, the palace made it quietly, but unmistakably clear. No working role, no working budget. That means if Meghan and Harry wanted to continue touring countries like Australia, they'd have to pay out of pocket. Flights, security, hotels, staff, the works. And here's the kicker. They didn't. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. Or perhaps because the math no longer made sense. Meghan, the Duchess who once dazzled in Cartier watches and custom gowns, suddenly found herself in a cold reality. Her influence didn't come with a check. Australia wasn't going to bankroll a vanity tour. Commonwealth governments weren't about to fund a couple whose royal status was now ambiguous at best. And the palace? They weren't lifting a finger. In the brutal world of global diplomacy, money talks, and Meghan's account was overdrawn. The optics were even worse. Lavish jewelry, a $16 million Montecito mansion, hundreds of thousands in designer fashion, yet somehow unable or unwilling to fund their own presence abroad. It reeked of entitlement without purpose, fame without substance. Australians noticed. So did the rest of the Commonwealth. Because if you want the privileges of royalty, you pay with service, not a credit card. And yet, even with their enormous media profile, the Sussexes couldn't secure the one thing that truly mattered: institutional legitimacy. Every unaccepted invitation, every dodged appearance, every maybe later email that never turned into a booking, they were all subtle reminders. You can't buy relevance, you can't wear influence, and no amount of Hollywood sparkle could hide the fact that Meghan Markle, without the monarchy, didn't hold enough weight to be invited back. In other words, it wasn't just about being blocked, it was about being broke, in power, in presence, and in purpose. And in Australia, that absence said it all. But Meghan wasn't done trying. And what she did next made things even worse. For a while, the image held. Meghan Markle, the glamorous duchess, the activist wife, the modern royal, still appeared in glossy magazines, red carpet lists, and social media slideshows. But beneath that perfectly curated exterior, something was unraveling. Not in an explosive tabloid scandal, but in a way far more damaging. Slow, quiet disinterest, the kind that turns applause into eye rolls and headlines into silence. Australia was the first to make that shift, and it wasn't by accident. Tom Bower's investigation lays it bare. The Commonwealth didn't reject Meghan in outrage. They rejected her by withdrawing from the stage. And as that spotlight dimmed, the public got a clearer look at what was really left behind. A brand built on beauty and buzz, but lacking depth. Meghan's influence wasn't backed by achievement. It was backed by narrative. A narrative that, over time, stopped making sense. Let's start with the receipts. The Netflix deal was supposed to catapult the Sussexes into a new kind of power couple. But the hype collapsed under the weight of poorly received content, long delays, and internal drama. The documentaries weren't breakout hits. They were cautionary tales in overexposure. Archetypes, the podcast meant to redefine Meghan as a feminist intellectual, fizzled out after one season. Critics called it vapid, scripted, and perhaps worst of all, forgettable. Then came Archewell, the charitable foundation that sounded impressive on paper. But in practice, the results were minimal. Headlines focused more on internal staffing drama and rebranding efforts than on actual philanthropic impact. Meghan's efforts, though often noble in intention, rarely translated into measurable change. And the media? They turned. Once, Australian outlets gushed over her every outfit and smiled at her every step. Now, they ask sharper questions. Where's the substance? Where's the real work? Why does every cause seem wrapped in a PR campaign? Even sympathetic voices grew wary, noticing how carefully curated her appearances became. How every moment seemed designed for the cameras, not the cause. The disconnect widened. Australians, like many across the Commonwealth, value authenticity. They appreciate effort, humility, and purpose. Meghan's brand, dripping in glamour, calculated in delivery, and constantly under the spotlight, began to feel hollow. Instead of a duchess championing change, many saw a celebrity chasing headlines. Instead of leadership, they saw a performance. And that's when the image began to truly collapse. Not because of one misstep, but because of a pattern. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Meghan attended star-studded Hollywood parties, Catherine was seen in hospitals, schools, and charity events. While Meghan launched lifestyle branding ventures, William worked quietly on mental health campaigns and veterans initiatives. The public noticed. And that comparison didn't just damage Meghan's reputation, it exposed it. The once unshakable image of a duchess who could blend royalty with modern celebrity had been shattered. And in places like Australia, where her star once burned brightest, the silence now felt deafening. But Meghan wasn't ready to let go of the spotlight. And her next move? It would only deepen the divide. By the time Meghan Markle arrived at Kevin Costner's charity beach party, the stage had already changed. This wasn't Buckingham Palace. It wasn't a global royal tour. It wasn't even a high-profile humanitarian summit. It was a Malibu fundraiser, sun-soaked, celebrity-studded, and utterly laid back. But Meghan didn't show up dressed for a casual afternoon. She arrived in full duchess mode, dripping in an estimated $300,000 worth of jewelry. Cartier, Lorraine Schwartz, designer of everything. The photos were impossible to ignore, and neither was the message they sent. She still believed she was the moment. But the crowd didn't agree. The Kevin Costner event wasn't just another Hollywood mixer. It was a reflection of how far Meghan had drifted from the public she once captivated. There she was, posing for photographers, layered in diamonds, flanked by security, trying to manifest influence through aesthetic alone. But instead of awe, the reaction was awkward. Whispers, raised eyebrows. Even among celebrities, it was too much. Tom Bower didn't miss the symbolism. He framed the incident not as glamour, but as desperation. A woman clinging to relevance through spectacle. Once, Meghan's appearances had purpose. To meet with leaders, to promote causes, to stand as a modern royal. Now, her very presence at a private party was dissected as a sign of decline. No speeches, no initiatives, no real reason to be there. Just sparkle without substance. And it wasn't just her arrival that raised eyebrows. It was the stark contrast. Other guests came in relaxed attire, blending in with the beachside vibes. Meghan stood out like a walking billboard, broadcasting importance no one was asking for. And Harry? Practically invisible. He hovered awkwardly in the background, a supporting character in Meghan's solo performance. The Sussexes weren't power players anymore. They were side attractions. The Costner fiasco became tabloid gold, but for all the wrong reasons. No one was talking about the cause. No one praised Meghan for her impact. The headlines were about jewelry, overcompensation, and the growing chasm between her public image and private reality. A duchess once seen as fresh and inspiring now looked like someone desperately chasing old headlines, in all the wrong places. And for a country like Australia, which had once welcomed her with open arms, this moment confirmed everything. She wasn't relatable. She wasn't grounded. She wasn't rising. She was floundering, publicly, awkwardly, and in high definition. That beach party wasn't a comeback. It was a turning point. And what it exposed would ripple far beyond Malibu, straight back to the very Commonwealth she once hoped to conquer. In the beginning, Meghan Markle's ascent into royalty was hailed as a cultural reset. A biracial, self-made American actress joining the world's most rigid institution? It was the kind of story fairy tales are made of. Only this time with cameras, podcast deals, and red carpet gowns. But fairy tales require more than sparkle. And when the glitter faded, all that remained was a brand with no foundation, a celebrity without a crown. Australia figured it out first. The silence wasn't accidental, it was tactical. Commonwealth countries like Australia have long-standing relationships with the British monarchy, not because of glamour, but because of structure, diplomacy, and legacy. And Meghan? She had shed the structure, ditched the diplomacy, and tried to rewrite the legacy on her own terms. But without the institution behind her, what was left? She wasn't a working royal. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a diplomat. She was something else. A duchess without duties, a celebrity with a controversial past. A public figure whose biggest skill was commanding attention, and not always for the right reasons. And in a post-royal world, where every appearance became a PR move, and every interview an act of rebranding, her credibility began to evaporate. Tom Bower's investigation lays out the rot beneath the polish. Meghan had the title, but none of the influence that the title used to guarantee. She had the fashion, the followers, and the interviews, but not the access, not the backing, and not the respect that comes from playing by the rules of the monarchy. Her attempts to bypass that system didn't elevate her. They exposed her. Australia, like much of the Commonwealth, isn't driven by Hollywood glitz. It values effort, integrity, and authenticity. Meghan's high-budget, low-impact lifestyle, complete with Netflix vanity projects and paparazzi-choreographed philanthropy, just didn't land. The causes she promoted were swallowed by the constant noise of her personal drama. The headlines weren't about her charity work. They were about walkout staff, altered timelines, and whispered diva demands. It was never supposed to be this way. She was once seen as the future of a modern monarchy. Now she's a cautionary tale. A woman who mistook temporary fascination for lasting influence. A duchess who tried to turn her royal moment into a media empire and found herself boxed out by the very system she tried to outshine. Because here's the truth. Titles don't matter without the institution behind them. Royalty isn't about personal branding. It's about service, continuity, and quiet influence that doesn't scream for attention. Meghan wanted the crown without the weight, the glory without the grind. And Australia saw through it. They didn't need to ban her. They just didn't invite her back. And in the court of global perception, that kind of silence is a verdict in itself. But the collapse wasn't over yet. Because while Meghan drifted further into image over impact, the Commonwealth made its final move. One that couldn't be spun, staged, or bought. No scandal, no headlines, no dramatic statement from the palace, just a void. Meghan Markle, once embraced as the face of a modern monarchy, now finds herself quietly erased, not by decree, but by design. And in the world she once commanded, with curated photos, Netflix deals, and viral interviews, the silence is louder than any backlash. Australia didn't slam the door. They simply stopped answering the knock. The country that once cheered her arrival now shrugs at her absence. There are no public protests, no hashtags, no burning outrage, just empty calendars and diplomatic indifference. And that's the cruel genius of the Commonwealth strategy. It doesn't attack her, it ignores her. Because in politics, in royalty, and in celebrity, irrelevance is the one thing you can't spin your way out of. Tom Bower's research paints the picture clearly. Meghan's downfall wasn't one moment. It was death by 1,000 contradictions, glamour without depth, influence without service, ambition without understanding. And in nations like Australia, where substance matters more than sparkle, the verdict arrived not with a bang, but with utter silence. She chased power, but lost her platform. She wore the crown, but dropped the commitment. She told her truth, but lost the trust. The Commonwealth's response? Cold, clinical, final. No invitations, no appearances, no relevance. The Duchess, who once believed she'd rewrite the monarchy's future, has been written out of its present, not because she was too bold, but because she misunderstood the game. And now the cameras have turned elsewhere. The headlines have moved on. The world she thought she'd rule has simply stopped noticing. No one slammed the gate. They just stopped opening it. And in the kingdom of influence, that silence is the crown she'll never wear again.